Level 1, the first test. You're 29 and 3 years out of a graduate chemistry program that didn't lead anywhere near the career you pictured. Working nights in a lab that isn't technically yours. Using equipment you're not supposed to have access to after hours. Chasing a formula you started as a thought experiment and can't stop thinking about now that it's actually working. You tell yourself it's research. You tell yourself a lot of things in that first year. The first real test isn't a lab animal. It's a man named Cole, who sleeps under the overpass 3 blocks from your building, who you've brought coffee to a handful of times over the winter without ever quite deciding why. You tell yourself you chose him because he's kind, because you like him. And none of that changes what you're actually doing, which is testing an unapproved compound on a person too vulnerable to say no to $20 and a promise that it's just a vitamin study. He drinks it without much hesitation. You watch him for 6 hours afterward, clipboard in hand, telling yourself the clipboard makes this science instead of what it actually is. Nothing happens for the first hour. Then he catches a bottle cap he flicked off a ledge before it can hit the ground, faster than his eyes should have tracked it, and looks at his own hand like it belongs to someone else. You feel something you don't have a clean word for. Half triumph, half a kind of vertigo. The specific feeling of having proven something you're not sure you were supposed to be allowed to prove. You give Cole $200 and tell him not to mention it to anyone. He doesn't ask why. People rarely do when the money's real, and the alternative is going back to nothing. Level 2, the first sale. The selling starts smaller than you'd expect, almost by accident. A friend from grad school, Priyanka, who still works in industry and still talks to you sometimes, even though your career paths went in wildly different directions, mentions offhand at a bar that a guy she knows would pay serious money for literally anything that gives an edge. You tell yourself you're not really a dealer. You're a scientist whose research needs funding, and this is just an unconventional grant. The first sale is $300 for a vial that lasts 4 hours. It buys you better equipment. The equipment buys you a better formula. The better formula buys you a second sale and a third, and by the time you notice you've stopped calling it research even in your own head, you're already 6 months and 40 transactions deep. Level 3, the improvement. You keep improving it. That part isn't greed, not entirely. It's the same compulsion that got you into chemistry in the first place, the itch of a problem that isn't finished. Version 1 gave 4 hours of minor reflexes and strength. Version 4 gives 6 hours of something closer to what you used to only read about in comics as a kid. Real strength, real speed, brief bursts of something like flight if the dose is right and the person's body doesn't reject it. You test each new version on new people first. Always people with nothing to lose and everything to gain from the cash. Always with the same careful clipboard. Always telling yourself the clipboard means something. Level 4, the news. You start seeing your work on television before you're ready to see it there. A robbery stopped by a bystander who moved too fast for the cameras to fully capture. You recognize the movement, recognize it as version 3, sold 6 weeks earlier to a guy who told you he just wanted an edge at his gym. Then, 2 weeks later, a different story. A bar fight that put 4 people in the hospital, one of them permanently, and the eyewitness description matches a build and a face you sold version 4 to yourself, twice at your own lab. No questions asked because questions were never part of the business model you built. You watch both stories in the same week, on the same couch, and you don't sleep well after either of them. You tell yourself the good outweighs the bad in some vague moral ledger you've never actually done the math on. You don't do the math now either. Doing the math would mean admitting there's a math to do. Level 5. The friend who leaves. Priyanka pulls away first, the way people who knew you before all this tend to. She doesn't confront you dramatically. She just stops returning texts as quickly, stops suggesting you meet up until one night she finally says it outright over the phone, voice careful, that she doesn't recognize the person she's talking to anymore, that the guy she went to grad school with used to talk about wanting to cure things, not sell them. You get defensive. You tell her she doesn't understand what real funding requires. You use language that sounds like a pitch deck instead of an actual answer, and you hear yourself doing it and you don't stop. Level 6, the man you started with. You go back to check on Cole eventually, months later, mostly out of guilt you won't name as guilt. He's not under the overpass anymore. It takes you 3 days of asking around to find him, and when you do, he's in worse shape than before you ever gave him anything. Jittery, thinner, chasing something he can't afford anymore because you stopped supplying him for free once the business scaled past favors. He asks you for more. You say no, the first no you've said in this entire story, and it costs you nothing to say it and everything to watch his face when you do, because you recognize, finally, uncomfortably, that you didn't just test a compound on him. You introduced him to a hole he didn't have before, and then you walked away from it once it stopped being useful to you. Level 7, the rule you broke. You swore from the very beginning that you'd never take it yourself. It was a rule you were proud of, evidence. You told yourself, that you were still a scientist and not just a supplier, that you understood the risk well enough to respect it. You keep that rule for almost 2 years. You break it on a night you don't plan. Your lab gets raided, not by police first, but by the dealer whose territory you'd quietly been encroaching on for months without fully admitting to yourself that's what you were doing. Two men, armed, already high on your own product, come for the formula and the money both. You have seconds, not minutes, and the only thing within reach that might actually even the odds is the vial you've refused to touch for 2 years, sitting on the same shelf it's always sat on, exactly where your own rule kept it, untouched, waiting. You drink it. What happens next isn't triumphant, the way you'd probably imagined it would be if you'd ever let yourself imagine it. It's violent and disorienting and too fast for your own mind to process. A strength that isn't really yours, moving through a body that never trained for it, breaking things it shouldn't, including, by the time the adrenaline clears enough for you to see straight, one of the two men who came for you, badly, permanently. You survived the night. That's the only clean fact left by morning. Level 8, what's left? Cole is the one who finds you 3 days later, of all people. Not because he's tracking you, but because word travels fast in the parts of the city you both know too well. And he'd heard your lab got hit and came looking, the way you used to look for him. Except now the roles have reversed in a way neither of you asked for. He finds you sitting on the floor of the wrecked lab, hands shaking, in a way that has nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a body that's been permanently changed by one dose it was never designed to survive gracefully. He doesn't say "I told you so." He doesn't say anything for a long time. He just sits down on the floor next to you, the same floor where 2 years ago you handed him a vial and called it a vitamin study. And he says the only thing that actually lands, quiet, without judgment, in a voice that sounds tired in a way that makes you understand, fully, for the first time, exactly what you cost him. He says, "You always said you'd never take it." You don't have an answer for that. You just sit there, in a lab that used to be about curing something, holding hands that will never fully stop shaking, next to the one person who has every right to walk away and doesn't.